And do all of that over now. All right, so now we're going, so as we move forward, starting here, we're going to start getting down into more of quote unquote Baptist history. And that'll come sort of in two forms. The first form will come as we sort of look at where you first start recognizing people that call themselves and were known as Baptists. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to see there's sort of three different, though, broad theories about Baptist origins, so to speak. Then we'll actually take a little bit of a break off because we need to go cover the rise of Methodism. It's really important because it swings back into later Baptist development as well. So the Methodist movement begins later than where we're going to be picking up today. So we'll detour over to that because it's important, because how it relates back to what was going on in broadly in what I would call evangelical churches, particularly with the missionary flair of Methodism that came into play, which then really was sort of adopted by Baptists. There's an interesting interplay there between the two. And then we'll come back around and we'll get down to some of the more modern Baptist history. Mickey suggested last week, which I think is excellent, we sort of left the Orthodox Church back in 1054. So we need to go back and check on them sort of at the end to see what happened. So we'll come back around to the Eastern Church sort of at the end and understand they did not have something similar in the Eastern Church in quite the same way that we know of as the Reformation. So that has an impact on where that church and group of believers is today, because they didn't pass through the Western European Reformation the same way that the Western Church did. And so that's part of the reason there's a difference in flavor. So I think it'll also provide a good contrast as we sort of get to the end there. And then, of course, along the way, as we go through the Methodist origins, that's where we'll pick up things like Pentecostals, Church of Christ, some of the other things that actually flow out of Methodism, and we'll bring all of that back together.
Church of Christ was in Baptist.
Huh?
Church of Christ
Yeah.
flows down the Baptist.
I meant to say not Church of Christ. I meant to say no, not Presbyterian. Pentecostals is what I meant to say.
You said Pentecostal.
So, but we'll see how those things all play together, and then try to bring it back around full bore. I'm going to be using a little bit more of the video start and stop teaching. I think it's good because it brings a different voice in, and also it actually leverages hours of my time in some ways. So that's another reason for doing it. Letting you know where a lot of this material that we're going to be using over the next couple of weeks is coming from. Mid-America Baptist Theological Seminary. A professor there by the name of Mikey Mewborn has a YouTube channel, and his course in the history of Baptists is online. And matching up with a lot of the research that I've done, I think it's a pretty balanced presentation. That's a very conservative theological seminary, just to put it in context, just so you know where they're coming from. Probably leaning a little bit towards fundamentalism, but not quite fully there from what I can tell by trying to research them. But I found everything that he taught in the course to be solid with other research that I did. So I always try to be careful about what I show there, or at least put the right caveat on it if it needs to be something else. So we're going to look at that. And today it's going to be a little bit of an overview. The first part of the video runs about 10, 11 minutes. We'll probably stop it twice inside of that. And it's going to eventually get down to today. We're going to sort of cover the three broad, I hate to use the word theories, thoughts, I don't even know, concepts of Baptist evolution. He's going to hit those things pretty well. We probably won't get into it this week, but next week we're going to talk about something that was a very important thing in the early part of the 17th century, which is as Baptists. The reason I sort of point to that as being the time when Baptists are coming to rise, that's when the point when people were calling themselves Baptists and other people were calling them Baptists. That not Anabaptist. We've talked about what's different about that, but this is where the term Baptist really was becoming something that was recognized. And that's in the early part of the 17th century. And during that particular time, we're going to see that we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between what are known as general Baptist and particular Baptist. And where that's going to tie back in, all that time we spent talking about Calvinism and Arminianism is going to connect us back around there. That's why that's going to be important. And by the way, it's particular Baptist, not peculiar Baptist. Just so you're in my head at one point, I kept thinking, why are they calling them peculiar? Oh, they're calling them particular. Different word. Different word.
Hey, Don, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
At the end of the last time we watched the video, it said that around the 17th century, there was more tolerance than previously. And I think that was for, just the different ideologies concerning different sects or whatever. Is that correct?
That's true and it's not true. In fact, that's an interesting part of what we'll get into here as we start talking about Baptists. We spent a lot of time talking about, when we talk about the English Reformation and then the Tudor moving into Stuart kings in England. Remember, we go from that flip-flop back and forth because of Mary, who's known as Bloody Mary. Then you come back to Elizabeth, and it's back to being Protestant, and she's sort of a more middle course there, sort of settling things down for a long time. Then remember, James follows her because she has no heir. So it's James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England. He's the James of the King James Bible. And he's Protestant much more strongly, though, in the vein of Anglicanism, and then I guess to whatever extent you want to talk about the Presbyterian Calvinist Scottish influence coming down. And so during James's reign, there are periods of time, and then subsequent to James's reign, where there's tolerance, but then the tolerance suddenly goes away. So you do go through these spasms of intolerance. And a lot of this intolerance is directed towards the early Baptists. That's the point that I want to make. Generally, there was sort of wider tolerance. It wasn't quite like it was underneath, for example, Mary with, enforcing Catholic doctrine. But to say that James was just, practice whatever you want to and it's all okay is not really an accurate way of thinking about things, or certainly his son Charles that follows. And so the answer to your question is yes and no. It depends on who you were as to how tolerant things were towards you. Baptists were on the less tolerated end of that spectrum, if that makes any sense. And a lot of that had to do with the issue of baptism, which is what Baptists, one of the distinctives there, around infant baptism, which was still part of the Anglican Church, versus this group that did not. So they were separated from the rest of Protestantism in England, the Anglican Church, because of that. Make sense?
Yes.
And so that becomes a key issue, and we'll see that moving through. All right. I'm going to go back just really quick. I've got lots of screens and lots of programs open here, so let me see if I can get to where I want to get to. So there's our, I haven't shared screen either. I've been recording, but not sharing screen, which I need to do. So there you go. So you should be able to see that now, which is just the heading. But we've used this chart a lot as we've gone through. So we actually have covered a lot of this. I'm going to just one click here. We've been to all of these breaks, well, including this one, the 1054 break, the great schism between the East and the West Church. 1517, obviously Luther. We've talked about the break off of what became the Anabaptists. 1536, Calvin coming into play. 1534, the Anglican Church coming into play. And of course, we also talked about the importance of this connector here, which is the interaction in England between those that are picking up on more Calvinist Reformed thought, but are still inside politically the area where the Church of England is. So not losing fact of the importance of this blue arrow that goes up and down. So today, what we're going to move to is this around 1607 period here. We've been around it in some other ways as we've gone through it. And so the question is, what happens around, notice it's CA 1607. You'll see dates of 1607 through 1609 being real prevalent here, where we're talking about the Congregationalists and the Baptists. Does anybody remember who the Congregationalists are?
I'm thinking of the churches in New England, but I don't remember who their leaders were in Great Britain.
Yeah, and they had actually several leaders in Great Britain, because these were, when we think about them in New England, we're going to spend some time, talking about in America here as we transition this over, which will become important. How Baptists come to and and are found in America. But these were various subsets that were either sort of okay within the Anglican Church or were part of the separatist movement from the Anglican Church. And Congregationalism primarily centered around the fact that they wanted to have, going back to that, even that Anabaptist idea of local authority. The congregation was the authority, not the Church of England.
So are the Congregationalists, the Unitarians, Baptists, and Quakers?
All
Is
of
that another term
all
for
of them would
those?
fall into various forms of what you might generally call congregationalism. So on this chart that we've been using, congregationalist is a broad term. Baptist, it could be argued, are almost a subset of that, but grow to be a different thing than that. And that's why on this particular chart, it breaks out this way, and certainly over time evolves into different things. But
Say one more time the definition you gave of the Congregationalist, or what
they were various parts. They're definitely Protestant, unless you want to take the argument, which we're going to look at today, that Baptists were never Protestant, but they're definitely not part of the Catholic Church. But they were not directly part of the Church of England in the classical sense. These are not Anglicans. So they are primarily broken off. The commonality across the board here is valuing the autonomy of the distinct congregation versus a monolithic, unified Church of England, Catholic Church, centralized church authority.
Okay.
But, Quakers would fall in this category. Many of the Baptists would fall in this category. There's lots of there's more Puritans.
John Smith was a Puritan.
Puritans were one of the. And again, there's the difference between separatists and Puritans. To go back a little bit, separatists were the ones that wanted to separate themselves from the Church of England. Puritans were the ones who wanted to stay inside of the Church of England and clean it up. But in many cases, those who started out as Puritans became separatists because they couldn't do that. So you might think of this as sort of the second Reformation movement. It's the first English Reformation was primarily political. We talked about that. This is sort of now the real English Reformation, but it's the Reformation against the Anglican Church, which had already broken from the Catholic Church. It gets a little bit confusing because there's lots of different groups here. And we're even going to see that all the Baptists aren't even necessarily the same group initially. It takes a while for them to figure out what's common about what's there. And that, for example, we're going to get down to the difference between General Baptists and Particular Baptists. That actually carried through until the early part of the 19th century, where that was still to some degree, it even still exists today, but definitely continues through into the 19th century among that's the two camps of Baptist thought on theology, looking at one of the issues that comes from the Calvinistic Arminianist question. It's basically, it's the general atonement versus limited atonement argument. It's the argument over the L of tulip. I'm trying to remember what the daisy, and so in daisy, that's the I guess. It's the distinction over that inside of Baptist. I think you'll find the video that we're about to look at. First of all, the front end's a little bit humorous, so I wanted to keep that in. Some of you may have seen the things that are there before. Particularly, I enjoy the little boy. You'll know what I'm talking about here when we get going. But then he goes off into an explanation of something we've already covered before, which are sort of Baptist distinctives, and then he moves into the Baptist heritage thing. So let me make sure I am good to go to share sound. Since we're going to do a video thing. And I'll ask you guys, as I always do, to let me know when you've got the audio on your end. Y'all hear that?
Hello, I'm Dr. Mewborn, and this is History of the Baptist. It is so good to be with you today. Let's go ahead and jump into our lesson today as we look at the history of the Baptist. The first slide I wanted you to see today is a very interesting one. This is a river, 1907. It's a winter baptism on Monroe, Kentucky. And I want you to see here, this is a very cold day, and they're doing baptisms in in the river. And one of the things I thought was so interesting about this is just the picture that it displays for us, that Baptists truly have endured a lot of things in their life to be what they are today.
I'm just going to ask you about this question. How many of you, this is just after the turn of the century, how many would be like, I can wait on that baptism thing. Summer's good. I know I converted and all, but you said it's not critical to my salvation. So can we just hold off till spring? The fall would be great.
That was the year my grandmother was born, 1907.
What is that?
That's what I was thinking. Why don't we just wait?
Yeah. So
And look at how many people are there to witness it too.
that was the thing that struck the thing that you're immediately drawn to, at
How
least
many
for,
people are standing on the ice? I'm sorry, I grew up in Texas. I would not be standing on the ice.
well, this is Kentucky, so we have to never mind. But the first thing that you're drawn to obviously is this, right? It's the baptism itself, right? And I think that's a lady. Would you agree that that's probably a lady there?
It's like a lady.
Probably.
So even that's a little bit interesting, obviously everybody dressed in, well, it's black and white. So these may not all be black, but everybody's in dark. This was an important occasion. But I agree with Kat. The first thing you're drawn to is the actual, the baptism. But then you're drawn to the fact that all these folks, lots of people. And I don't think this is probably right behind the church. We don't know if it's right behind the church, but the implication is they had to travel some distance, at least walk a distance over to this in the cold. And again, it was important enough that they broke open the ice of the river. Because the implication is the rest of the river is okay to stand on. But to his point, what this immediately screams to you is this thing here must be important. Baptism must be important, or else you wouldn't do it, right? This wouldn't do it this way. Any other thoughts just evoked by that picture?
Sins were washed away and frozen.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Get them both ways. Get you fully disinfected from your sin. I was initially going to start past this, but I thought, no, this is actually an important thing for us to look at, because this is also a witness or a testament to others that, okay, this baptism thing, they take it seriously. What does that mean? What is that about?
And so as we study the history of the Baptist, I think this picture is apropos when we talk about the tough times that they've had to go through. And if you could imagine being baptized in a frigid water, just ice cold water, that was probably very tough on the pastors, very tough on the congregants, whoever was being baptized that day. But I think that this is a great picture to begin with. I wanted to show you something else. This is the First Baptist Church in America. It's Providence, Rhode Island. It was established in 1775, or was opened on that day. And I think that that's kind of an interesting picture. We'll talk more about this church as we continue on through the class. But I had to show you a few things that I thought were so funny. I call this baptisms gone wrong, but I'm not really sure. If you'll follow me on the left-hand side, you might have seen these before, but watch the little boy on the left. I love it. He's so excited. He goes ahead and takes care of the baptism himself, Maybe that guy's name's John Smith. And y'all will know more about that as we get into the history of the Baptist. John Smith baptized himself. Look at this next one. This guy is baptized with a basketball. Man, that is taking your game with you type thing. That's pretty funny. This next guy, get ready for it because it's going to come quick. Just look on the right, top right. Boom. Just baptized. I mean, truly taken down. And then this next one. Now, this is the way babies need to be baptized. I've got a 3-month-old baby at the house, and I can't imagine. Look at that child's face. So I'm not really sure about all these baptisms and how they all really played out, but this is just interesting stuff here. Baptism's gone wrong, but what is the deal with this? Why does this really matter? And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today with Baptist Beginnings. As we get started in this, who are the Baptists? So that's something we're going to look at. The next thing is, why should we study the Baptist? Next thing is, who was the first Baptist, or who were the first Baptists? Also, when and where was the first Baptist church established? And then also the last thing is this: what are the distinctive characteristics of Baptists? So those are some things we're going to look at today as an overview. Not going to go too deep into anything today, but I just want to give a little bit of an overview so that you know where we're going. So why should we study the Baptists? Ultimately, a few of the reasons why. Number one, to know the key distinctives of the tradition. The word distinctives, sometimes I think the Baptist faith, they take on this word, people in the Baptist faith, and they're the ones who started this word of distinctives. It's kind of an interesting word. You put it in spell check and it always comes back wrong. But when you're talking about religious beliefs, it's apparently right. So to know key distinctives of the tradition, to be able to communicate the distinctives, and also to understand the biblical and theological commitment to the distinctives, to protect and abide by the distinctives, speaking the precision to a postmodern generation. So we need to be able to do that, and then to appreciate on whose shoulders we stand. So who were the Baptists before? And so you might be in this study and you might be a Baptist, or maybe you're not. You're just here learning and you're growing in this understanding and study. Well, however you come to this, it's kind of important to know where the Baptists started from, because there's a lot of different beliefs on where the Baptists came from and what how they were started. So we'll kind of look at those as we go. Who are the Baptists and why are they called the Baptists? Well, the word Baptist is the word where we get the word baptizo in the Greek. It simply means I immerse. That's what the word baptizo means. I immerse. It means to immerse in water ultimately, or going further, to submerge. One of the things that's important is for this word is it is one of the few untranslated words in the Greek New Testament. It simply means to immerse. That's what the word means. And I'll help you to see that in this next verse, or in this verse here. It says in Romans 6:4, it says, we were buried, therefore, with him by baptism into death, in order that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, we too might walk in newness of life. What's happening in this scripture and in this passage is that there is a baptism. Now, it's not referring to a water baptism here, but it's referring to immersion. That's what you need to take note of in this passage. This passage is a very, what we call sometimes a dry passage. There's no water included in this passage. But what we see is that people are being baptized into something, and they're baptized into death. You can't be partly baptized into death. You can't be sprinkled with death. You have to be fully immersed in it. It's kind of like somebody being pregnant. You're not just a little bit pregnant. You're either completely pregnant or not. And so that's what we're talking about. Either you're dead or you're not. And that's why it's so special when the Apostle Paul, talking to the Romans, or he's talking to the Galatians, he says, for I'm crucified with Christ, that I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. He was saying, I was baptized into the death of Jesus Christ. And so what he's making clear in that passage for us is that that old man is no longer there now. He's been made new. He's been made anew, okay? And that's starting with his soul. His soul has been made new. And so that's what we're looking at when we're looking at all these things. As we continue on, who were the first Baptists? And so let me give you an overview on this a little bit. Successionist Theory. Now, this is probably one of the funnest theories to actually look at when you're looking at the history of the Baptist. And so we're going to study this at length later time, but I want to give you some names real quick. J.R. Graves, old landmarkism is what he came up with. We're talking about in the late 1800s. And Graves fervently believed Baptists had perpetually preserved New Testament beliefs and practices, having never departed from apostolic truth and tradition. So if you want to take it all the way back to John the Baptist, or really Jesus Christ is what he's going to talk about, but all the way back to Jesus Christ and the start of the church, when he started that, when Christ started the church, there has never been a time where there weren't Baptistic people. And that's what he's saying. He's saying there was always these true believers who were baptized correctly throughout what we call as Christendom or the church age. Okay? And so J.M. Carroll picked this up also with The Trail of Blood in 1931, a book he called The Trail of Blood. And this is the younger brother of B.H. Carroll. Now, I've done a lot of study on B.H. Carroll. I believe B.H. Carroll had a photographic memory. He was one of those Baptist believers that was just so intelligent. We'll study more about him as we go through Baptist history, but this is his younger brother, J.M. Carroll. Carroll was inspired by Graves in the writing of his historiography of the martyrdom entitled The Trail of Blood.
You've heard me reference this a number of times. He's going to show some of the charts here in a minute. So a couple of key terms here. Successionist. What does it mean to be this is not about successful versus failure. This is successionist, meaning what? Meaning ongoing or sustaining, right?
Like the succession to the monarchy.
Yeah. So again, what did he say the concept behind successionist theory is in terms of Baptist development?
Goes all the way back to John the Baptist and Jesus.
Who was the first Baptist into that theory? Jesus was the first Baptist. And that there has been an unbroken, maybe stretched and stressed situation, but there's an unbroken line that you can go back that draws itself all the way back then to the Gospels and to the New Testament, particularly the book of Acts, where you will find believers who you would recognize in their theology, at least at its core, as being Baptist. And this is referred to as being, in fact, you'll hear this, landmark Baptist or landmarkism goes all the way back to their Graves being the originator of that. So we talked before a couple of weeks ago, and he mentioned it earlier in the video here today, what are some of the distinctives of Baptist?
Immersion.
Immersion.
I was going to say local authority.
Right. What's the appropriate role for baptism?
Believers.
When you believe,
Right. So
genuine.
So credo baptism versus pedio baptism, infant baptism. What else?
Authority of the word.
Authority of the word, scripture. Even as scripture was being formed, being focused towards scripture. The amazing part to me, we've talked about this before, the amazing part to me is even during Paul's lifetime, while he's still writing, others are recognizing what he's writing as being scripture. That's amazing to me, which tells you how the Holy Spirit was working through that. So when Carroll comes along and writes The Trail of Blood, he's picking up, by the way, this started as a lecture that then converted into a book, by the way. He's picking up on the concept of landmarkism, tying back to the successionist theory, but he's focusing here, his Trail of Blood is primarily focused on a history of martyrdom. So it's showing the martyrdom trailing back this line of succession, but he's focusing more on the fact that there have been those who have died for this belief. That's why it's the Trail of Blood. That's why it's not called the Trail of Baptism. The reason the blood is in there is because of the aspect of martyrdom, meaning that there are those that that gave up their lives to hold on to this belief. Questions or comments about that?
Who's B.H. Carroll? Since I'm such a...
B.H. Carroll was J.M. Carroll's older brother. He was a very influential Baptist in the middle to late 19th century. And you mentioned, well, we'll cover this. We'll hit some of that as we go through, because this is now getting into some of the things that went on inside of the evolution of Baptist theology in the 19th century. That's also where you continue to have the play out of general versus particular Baptists and the role of evangelism and missions and what's going on there. Today, we would definitely consider all of these folks that are referenced here being on the very, 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 very theologically conservative end of Baptist thought / fundamentalist Baptist thought. Not making that a label that's good or bad, just making that a label that's understood.
And he did that in 1931. It was published in 1931. So let me show you. If you've ever seen this book before, it's really interesting, but there is a map in this book, and it'll kind of look like this, and I'll show you the real one in a moment. But the landmark Baptist, you can kind of see here, back in the 1st century, we've got the Christians all the way on the left-hand side. Jesus organizes church in Mark chapter 3, and we see that. And you see these red dots all through there. This is where the true Baptists, the true believers, were throughout church history. And so here they are. They're popping up, and they're all over the place. And so we have them called in Antioch Christians right off, but then they continue on, and what they call them a lot of times is Anabaptists as they go through the Dark Ages. This is the same time the Catholic Church is going forward. You see this break off as we look into the late 800s. You see, continuing through the Dark Ages, you see a split with the Greek Catholics, and you see Roman Catholics, but you still see these red dots everywhere, right? This is the so-called true church, the true Baptist or Baptistic believers, many times called the Anabaptists. And then you get all.
So notice where the dots are, and this is just generally representational, but notice where the dots aren't.
At the top?
The dots don't overlay any of these branches.
Right.
But they're scattered.
They're scattered.
So what does the scattering represent? Like locations or?
Yeah.
I mean, I can make a chart like that and just put some dots on it.
And he's going to show the next chart here in a minute. There's lots of different versions of this chart. Yes, some of these are locational. This is more of a generalized version of that chart. We'll see the other one here in a second.
So
There's no y-axis. There's nothing to tell us what the
Yeah.
reference to.
Right. The
Said-
dots mean nothing to me.
Said the math teacher. There's no y-axis.
That chart does nothing for me. I can't make
In
heads or tails
statistics,
of it.
we would call this a misleading graph.
It's a misleading graph. Okay. The key thing that I want to point out is notice where the dots aren't.
Right.
Because the take here is that the landmark or secessionist Baptist take is that Baptists do not derive out of the Protestant Reformation. They're
Right.
found in it, they intermingle with it, but they are distinct from it. That's the key thing to get here. By the way, I think there is truth to that to a degree, but I also think it misses a key point, because you can be one of these red dots inside of one of these other things as well. And I think that's the tough thing that we try to figure out here.
The way into the late or early 1500s, and then you see kind of this branching of all these different denominations, and so that began at that time. But what you see through that is these people groups throughout there. Okay, so this is what we're looking at with the Landmark Baptist. Here is more of a clear view of this, of what's going on. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this.
This is actually from the original document here. So there's a little bit of location down here. Again, to your point, to everybody's point, the chart is sort of confusing to me in this sense of I'm not quite sure why that dot's there and why that dot gets to be there and why this dot gets to be here. It's not.
And what are the gray dots
Gray dots.
on the left-hand side?
These are the things that tie back to the original, the things that become gray here in terms of the branch off of what we think of as being the Orthodox Church. The argument being made here is there is no hierarchical Catholic Church until when? Until Constantine and Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire and starts to be organized around that in the sense of the things that we talked about, the various councils and the other things that go from there.
So are they saying by putting this dot kind of here in England,
By the way, I'm pointing to where Kathy's pointing.
that there were Christians in England in 100?
Yes, which is probably, which is not just probably true, it is true.
Okay, then what about this dot here?
I don't know. I didn't
Okay,
make the
okay.
chart.
Okay. I'm like, again, I find this chart like, how did they go back and historically say that there was all of these red dots? The thing that I find a hard time struggling with this concept is the fact that we've gone through an awful lot of history, and it looks like this theory didn't come about until 1880, kind of a thing. So how can they follow it back?
The argument will be made by the Carrolls and Graves that he's just organizing and recognizing what was already there. It's not new. It didn't spring forth in 1880. It was there. He organized it as such.
Okay, you don't have to defend it. I know you didn't write it.
Yeah, but and again, if you want to understand better, you can. I will put. I think I have a PDF copy of it, so I'll attach it to the Sunday school website because it's out in public domain. You can go out there and read it. You can decide for yourself what it is. Do a little YouTube search for Trail of Blood. You can go for hours on watching people present it in a modern sense. So I'll let them defend it. I have a tough time defending it because it's not what I personally believe is the more correct understanding, but it's definitely out there. And I know, Doug, you've mentioned this before, and others. There are some that hold to this is the only thing that makes sense when it comes to Baptists.
Yes.
They don't want to hear anything. Don't be bringing me that Anabaptist stuff. Don't be bringing me that Reformation stuff. This is it. To me, it's amazing when I see this older chart. For example, popery was officially established. Popery. There does tend to be a very anti-Catholic strain to landmark Baptist thought. Not just neutral towards it, but moving more towards hostile. Of course, you could also say the truth of other Protestant, the whole element of Protestantism is that was obviously at some point became definitely anti-Catholic or opposed to the Catholic Church. But there's very much that contained inside of the landmark approach.
So Don, each of those dots maybe I've said it and I've missed it. They represent someone who has been baptized or someone who was martyred, or
they represent martyrs, parenthetical S.
okay.
So churches or individuals that have died for true belief.
Okay.
And they would argue not just persecuted from outside the church, but persecuted from inside the church as well.
So I dare not ask the question, but why does the vein of red dots start at 3075 or 375?
I think a big part of that, from what I understand of this, and I've tried to understand it, this is showing the more traditional carrying forward that really was in opposition. Notice the sort of the timing of the hierarchical church versus this. It's sort of showing that once there was a hierarchical church, there was a more organized, standard, I guess opposition is the word that I'll use, or consistent group of Baptists that were being persecuted by the mainline church.
I forgot my copy of the Trail of Blood, but I was looking online and there I noticed on the footnote of the one I'm looking at, it says the red circles represent churches.
Right.
Where somebody was martyred.
Yes, and they definitely represent martyrdom. The key thing I want you to draw here is there are Baptists today, believe me, there are Baptists today who this is the only thing that they hold to and want to hear about Baptist heritage. They're there. So when we talk about the other things, they're not going to, gotta be careful. I don't want to twist it. They're not as open to the concept of some of the other things we're going to talk about here in a second. This is a viewpoint. This is a held viewpoint that is normally, when it's held, is incredibly strongly held. In fact, they view some of the other things that we're about to talk about here as almost, in some cases, having a heretical bend to them. That's how strongly held they are.
Having, oh, what is the term Paulatians?
That these were ones that just held more directly true to Paul's teachings. Kathy just reminded me of a deacon in the church that we grew up in. He was
Paul said it.
Joe Huddleston loved him some Paul. I'll just put it that way. He would have been the one that would have argued heavily for that Hebrews had to have also been written by Paul. Because if it's in the New Testament, it's good. Yeah, there's a couple of those John and Peter letters. I recognize those, but it's all Paul all the time.
So would that make David Kester a Donatist because he does whatever Donna says?
I'm not going to touch that. I'm not going to touch that one, and I'm going to hit.
Yeah, there's some falsehood in that
you'll find the
statement.
Trail of Blood book that J.M. Carroll has, or he wrote, and it's kind of showing what took place and where all these Christians were and what they where they fall on this map and on the timeline. And so that's kind of what we're looking at there. All right. Hey, one of the things I want to show you in the 1500s. So go toward the 1500s and you'll see this branching off of all these different denominations and a lot of things. The branches go way out a lot more than this, but this is some of them. And why did that take place? Well, it's very simple. Because of the Gutenberg printing press.
Yeah, we're going to skip over this. We've talked about the value of the printing press. You know, part of the timing of Luther kicking off the Reformation in that sense, closely tied to the fact that now you can publish and quickly spread ideas through the printing press. It's a huge, the printing press is one of the most important things invention-wise in history, and the timing of it relative to the church is very important. So any tied up questions on the successionist theory thing before we jump into something else? We will come back and revisit it because it will weave its way through the rest of Baptist history. But it's good to have that as a starting point to understand that as one of the broad areas that's there. Yeah, I'm skipping ahead. I actually have it queued over here in a link. Let me skip ahead to it.
Look at it if you can. Who were the first Baptists? Also, another theory is Anabaptist Kingship theory. You see guys like A.C. Underwood and William Estep. They write about this. What this simply saying is General Baptists shared similarities with Dutch Waterlander Mennonites. And we'll read more about that in Holland when we study Holland a little bit. This is what they agreed on. Believers' baptism only, religious liberty, separation of church and state, and Arminian views of salvation, predestination, and original sin. It is believed that the Anabaptist influence theory is making a comeback. So based on some of the writing of these guys and based on some of the writing against some of the main reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin, there is this push toward Anabaptist thought and theory, and this is the way the Baptists started. And so there's a lot of talk about those types of things, and so when we study the Anabaptists more in detail later on, you'll kind of see why some people are going down those roads. Also, Protestant churches, I just want to show you this really quick. You see Protestant Reformation is happening there in the 16th century. We have Lutheran, Martin Luther with that. We have going down with Reform with John Calvin. You see down further in 1525, Anabaptist with Ulrich Zwingli. We see that happening. And then from that, you see kind of the Mennonites starting and branching off, and Amish, and all this stuff is happening during this time. I don't know if y'all know a lot about Luther and Zwingli, but they had a lot of head-to-head battles about some things. One of the things was definitely Lord's Supper. That was always a point of contention for a lot of these reformers. And then of course, the other thing would be infant baptism, believer's baptism, credo baptism, all those types of things. And they really debated over this stuff. And so as we get a little deeper into understanding the Protestant Reformation bringing about the Anabaptists and the Baptists in general, we'll start covering those areas a little bit more. And so if you kind of look further in, you start seeing some more dates as they go up. 1560, Presbyterian, 1592, Congregationalist. In 1612, we see John Smith with what we call a Baptist church. And so we'll talk about that as we go. But there's the Methodists up there with John Wesley in 1787. All right, continue on with who was the first Baptist. There's another way you can look at it, and the theory is 17th century English separatism. King Henry VIII, there's a lot we can talk about with this guy, but he was truly a person who he did what he wanted to do as a monarch. He had 6 wives, and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, he did not want to be married to her. And so that created contention between him and the Pope and the Catholic Church and created a whole big issue. And so what he decided to do was, or the Church of England, what he decided to do was separate. And so since they would not grant him divorce, he started a new religious system, the Church of England, in his own way. And we'll talk more about that beginning, because some people say the Church of England has been in existence for years upon years before this. And then also they're saying, well, there's a start with him. And so we'll kind of uncover that more. But through this, it became very crooked. It became very messed up. Puritans, people that were known as Puritans, did not like the church that was run the church was run by a monarch. And so what some of them did was try to purify the church. That's why they're called Puritans. But then we have people that are separated and called the separatists. They separate from the Church of England over polity. And a lot of what we see in America and how America was founded, it was founded in many ways by what we call our pilgrims. And those people were known, those pilgrims are also known as separatists. What they were doing is saying, we don't want to purify the church. There's no way of really purifying the church. It's a broken system. So what they decided is we're going to sail over to the New World, and they're going to start what we call is America. And so that's a part of the beginning of how America started, all right? And so that's what we see with those types of things. As we continue on,
so let me tell you just plainly so you know where I'm coming from. This is full disclosure. I think there are elements of all 3 of these things that are definitely true. I hold to more of a blended concept here about the origin of Baptists. I think Baptists do tie back to a strong scriptural basis that can be tied back to what the early church, the first century church looked like. When you look, for example, at Pentecost being a good example of this. And it says, and on that day, 3,000 souls were baptized into the faith. That was believers' baptism. We have the story of the Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. I think there's a lot in Acts, for example, that we can point to that refers to the type of practice, for example, when it comes to baptism, that ties all the way back. So I hold to that sort of side of the trail of blood landmarkism kind of approach, in that I think a lot of Baptist theology, we used that term before, we talked about it being primitive meaning going back to the origin, primacy. I think that a lot of that's there. I think if you saw that list of distinctives, remember we spent some time covering the Anabaptists. Remember the separation of, sort of separation of church and state, the religious liberty, all of those types of things. You definitely can see those influences in modern Baptist thought. I think that's part of the reason you see that Anabaptist kinship theory come into play. And then I also believe, because we're now talking about among the first church that were called Baptist arose in England and the Netherlands, they are part of this English separatist thing also as well. So I don't hold that any one of these 3 is the be all end all solo thing. I think it is a combination of all of these things that are playing together. Does that make sense? And we're going to see that how Baptists come to America is very much what he just talked about. It's the timing of the rediscovery, the exploration of and settlement of the New World by Europeans happens to be at the time when this is going on inside of religious circles. And so they have to They have to come full circle on that.
That's the paper.
Any questions or thoughts about that? Take us back a little step here. Oh no, I'll actually get rid of that. Of course, we covered all the background there for the Anglican Church and Henry, and we've already been through all of that.
In 1700s started as intense reform movements from Puritan separatists and Anabaptist movements. Certain separatists adopted believers' baptism, and the doctrine soon followed. And then early 1700s, the First Baptists split into two main groups: Calvinists, which believe in predestination for salvation, or predestined for salvation, and then Arminians, able to fall from grace. You see over on the right-hand side, why did they come to America? And we see there with the differences between the Pilgrims and the Puritans. And I already talked about this a little bit. The Separatists, they believed they wanted to separate because they didn't see the church changing, and the Puritans wanted to stay and keep and make things better. As we go a little bit further, let me just share with you the two groups that come out of what is called the First Baptist movement, all right? We got the General Baptists and we got the Particular Baptists. The General Baptists are what we call more Arminian in their thought process, and then we got Particular Baptists who are not Arminian, they're more Calvinistic in their thinking. So let's just look at the General Baptists for a moment. We've got general atonement, that Jesus Christ died on the cross for all, influenced more by Jacob Arminius, and then greater focus on free will. We have the freedom to believe in Jesus Christ, and there's a greater focus on that. And then some believe that a person could fall from grace, so they believe that people could lose their salvation. Some of them believe that. But on the Particular Baptist side, this is a particular group of people who believed a particular group of people would be saved, and only that particular group. That means there's particular atonement. Jesus Christ died on the cross for only the elect. Influenced more by John Calvin, greater focus on predestination, God's causing these things to occur, and then perseverance of the saints, that if you're a child of God, you will persevere as a saint.
To take us back to the slide before, where do you think modern Baptists fall today?
Which Baptist? Which church?
I think
Earlywood Church, Uvalde Baptist Church, First Baptist Church?
and you're also talking about which person sitting in the pew or the chair, right?
Exactly, yeah.
I think most people that sit in the pew of a church don't know what they believe.
Yeah, I think it's all of those things. I think there are very particular churches that call themselves Baptist that still fall more or less more intently on, the way this is organized here at a high, simple level. I think for a lot of Baptists, it's a blender in the middle. We like this free will thing. We like the general atonement, the idea that Christ, of course, died for all, not just for those that have been elect. But we don't like that last point, right? That you can lose your salvation. So we pick up perseverance of the saints. I think a lot of Baptists sort of fall in this big middle area, and it's a blend of these two things, which I also don't think is bad. It's just an understanding of that this is a spectrum. It's a spectrum that still exists today. And inside of what we generally call Baptist churches with Baptist theology, we agree on some of those. Again, it's distinctives. We don't necessarily, we're not a creedal people in terms of having, creeds and that type of thing that we look to or point to. There is an element of individual, in fact, there's referred to as there's soul liberty, there's individual, the accountability of the believer. We even have a term for that, priesthood of the believer.
Yeah, priesthood of the believer.
And so the First Baptists and even Baptists all the way down to today are going to keep straddling back and forth across these lines. And you're going to find people in what are clearly Baptist circles that are among a spectrum that exists here. That's the thing I want you to draw from this as we move further down this. There is not one monolithic thing that you can point to say that's Baptist and only that is Baptist. Baptists are a patchwork quilt inside of a boundary, but a patchwork quilt of some theology that exists today. if that analogy makes sense. I'm gonna finish out the video.
Group of people who believed a particular group of people would be saved, and only that particular group. That means there's particular atonement. Jesus Christ on the cross for only the elect. Influenced more by John Calvin, greater focused on predestination, God's causing these things to occur, and then perseverance of the saints, that if you're a child of God, you will persevere as a saint. As we continue on, we see this. General Baptist, some of those, John Smith, Thomas Helwys, were leaders of the earliest Baptist churches. At least 47 of these churches were started in England by 1650. And then the particular Baptist, we got Henry Jesse, William Kiffin, and John Spilsbury led the charge for the particular Baptist. At least 7 of these types of churches were functional by 1644. All right. And so this is stuff's happening in the 1600s. Things are happening with Baptist churches, whether they're general or particular. And so you kind of see this coming from Reformation type stuff. Some of it's coming out of, we're responding to the Church of England. Other things are responding to the Catholic Church. There's some responses. And there's some who would say, well, there's an Anabaptist movement that's been going on for years, different theories there. What are the distinctive characteristics?
I'm going to stop here because I can cover this. We'll sort of finish up. I really like this. Notice it's an acrostic Baptist. So what are the distinctives of Baptist beliefs? We've talked about these, and of course, these are all referenced with scripture passages, which is good. I think we'd all agree biblical authority. We've talked about this, autonomy of the local church. Autonomy of the local church also means autonomy of the individual believer accountable to biblical authority. That's the priesthood of all believers. We don't have sacraments inside the Baptist church. We have ordinances, 2 of them, believer's baptism and the Lord's Supper. Individual soul liberty, a strong bend towards separation of church and state, and that there are only 2 offices in the church, pastor, elder, and deacon. And notice that where are those offices invested? They're invested in the local church. Would you agree that that's a pretty good summary of what you might call distinctives of Baptist thought?
Yes.
And it picks up a nice acrostic too for Baptist as it does that.
Why have I never, until you were doing this video, why had I never, as growing up in a Baptist church, why had I never seen this before?
What was that?
Has anybody seen the acrostic for Baptist?
No.
Not sure.
I'm going to go ahead and stop the video here and try to magically carry us back to here. Oh,
Maybe, Kathy, it's because we've been believing this for years. We don't need to write it down.
Oh, I think there's a truth to that. I know I've heard Doug say this before. You know, the toughest things in history to pin down when historians go back to the things that were common knowledge, you know, every day, day in, day out, because nobody necessarily writes that down because everybody knew it. And the same is sort of true. I think
That's
of our
the Weisskopf victim of historiography.
and the same thing happens inside of our theology. We don't need to talk about it because we all know it, right?
Yeah.
So as you can see, this 1607 date, which is approximate, we'll get into this next week. This is where you see Baptist becoming distinct from the rest of that Congregationalist, Pilgrim, Separatist, all the other stuff that's going on there in the broad category of Congregationalists. This holds much more to an influence from Anabaptist theory, coming through the Calvin and Arminian perspectives, but also not forgetting that that connection back to this is going on tremendously inside of England. So it's going on inside of the area where the Anglican churches come to be. And we are about 1534 to 1607. So we were about 70 years removed from Henry's break of taking England away from the Catholic Church. But the evolution that's happened over that period of time through the reigns of Mary, Elizabeth, and now into James, And of course, the other big thing that's happened, it happened before 1534, the European rediscovery or recognition of the New World. But the period of time when the New World is being settled is very much in this time frame. The first settlement in the Americas. You might know what year Jamestown is.
Jamestown?
Yep.
1607.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow.
So to put it in context, this is just now as English settlement. The Spanish had already settled in the Caribbean and Mexico and along the coast of South America and Central America. That had happened mainly about a century before. The French are here, others are coming, but the real start of English settlement begins in the early part of the 17th century, and it's a parallel thing that's going on as this is happening in the church as Baptist theology and the Baptist denomination is coming to play, which also means there's going to be Baptists that are coming to America. And we'll talk about that as we move through this.
So that double blue line is more the separatist theory.
Yeah, it's the recognition that this does flow off of Luther's reform and the additional stuff from Calvin as a result of that, but don't lose track of the fact that this is being influenced by what's going on in the Anglican Church. This chart makes it nice and linear and straight. It's not nice and linear and straight. There's heavy interaction going on here.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly Baptists are not purely just Lutherans and Calvinists who have taken a slightly different bend, because
Right.
they are influenced by their English culture, what's been in the Church of England, even as the way it's existed for 70 years, including the political and religious strife that's gone on in England. Henry, Mary, moving through that whole succession of monarchs that we covered before. That's why that was important to cover, is to understand the backdrop that this is being dropped into. The latter part of this, after 1607, we're going to go a little bit further. We're going to get into the Glorious Revolution, a period of time when there is no monarch. The Cromwells are ruling. All of this is the political backdrop to what's going on in the religious context here. And James, for the most part, the James of King James Bible fame, is not known for being overly religiously tolerant. Okay. Any questions, thoughts? All right. I'm going to stop the recording. I'll stop the share. I'm going to come down here and stop the recording.